Firestone was a rabbi, right?
I know he's a PhD and his wife is a rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember if he's a rabbi or not.
Yeah, I don't remember either. You don't think so? Okay.
He's just a PhD.
Okay. Well, I'll call him Mr. Firestone then, but
you call him Doctor.
Doctor. Doctor also mentioned what you were saying right now, where throughout history, he would say, when there was persecution, like the pogroms in Russia, that the Jewish communities would essentially adopt the local majority religion, and they would have a political face that they would put on as a way of defense.
I'm not aware of Jews. The only place I'm aware of Jews actually converting to the local religion was in Spain and Portugal. And it was more because they were very assimilated and they thought this was their ticket into society. Just like we have in 19th century, early 19th century Germany, you'd have Jews do the same thing, like the famous poet Heinrich Heine.
Right.
And he said it was his admission ticket. It wasn't so he could go to church more often. But that's really the only case I can think of. In general, Jews in Europe didn't convert. They just were persecuted and then expelled and brought back.
Well, it's like exactly what you just said. It wasn't like even a technical real conversion. It was more like we need to get them off our backs kind of thing.
So the Jews were often protected by the nobility. The problem is they also were the source of funding, loans, and the nobility would then dry up and owe the Jews so much money that it was easier to kick them out than to pay them back.
How did that work? Is that implying that the Jewish people were involved in executive finances or political finances at the time?
They were involved, not that they wanted to be. Jews were not allowed to do almost anything else. They couldn't join guilds. They couldn't be craftsmen. They couldn't do almost anything else. And they were forced. It was a terrible thing because they were forced into doing something that needed to be done, but no one falls in love with a moneylender, especially when it's 200% interest as it was and things like that. And then they're blamed for doing it. Think of Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. They're blamed for doing it, even though they have to do it because the nobility needs it. But then the nobility can turn around and say, those Jews, we have to get rid of them because look what they're doing. They're loaning money at interest. Shocked.
So they were scapegoated.
Where did the money come from? Like where did the large amass of money?
So Jews didn't have a lot of money, but they had a lot of things that meant they could do the banking. Number one, they trusted one another. They had large families in different areas. And number two, they had the literacy to do it. So, unfortunately, but it's not like you're making money except through money. It's like equities today. They didn't produce anything. They weren't allowed to produce anything. But if you're loaning money at 200% interest, you're going to make some money.
Right.
Yeah. Do you think they also had, because they were loaning the money, they had some sort of say in what was going on?
No, mostly in Europe anyway, except for Spain, I'll say that's a little different. But in most of Europe, the Jews never had power, but they would have someone called a Stadtland or an ambassador, someone with some wealth who would represent the Jews with nobility. In Spain, Muslim Spain in the Golden Age, it was a little different. There was someone named Shmuel Hanagid, the great leader who we're talking about more than 1,000 years ago. He was the vizier, the second in command of Spain, Muslim Spain, as a Jew, and he wasn't hiding his Judaism at all. Now, unfortunately, his son took over, and his son had some arrogance about him, so he was killed. They put a sword through his neck because as long as you knew your place, you were fine. But you're never on the level of the Sultan. That's not knowing your place.
Interesting.
I pretty much get all my stuff from Dr. Firestone.
Right. That's a good source.
So I keep just remembering so many things. Yeah. Oh, I was going to ask about where was the origin of this knowledge of finance in the community come from?
That's a good question.
Yeah. I think even in the Torah, there are some financial things. They're pretty simple. And then you get to Rabbinic Judaism 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. And one has to know about finance. I'll give you an example. Jews throughout the world since the 1920s, if they choose to, can study a page of Talmud every day in sync with other Jews doing it. Same page. Takes 7.5 years. And so today, for instance, we're on a certain page of a tractate in the Talmud, which the Talmud is Jewish rabbinic literature about life and all sorts of things from 1,500 years ago in Babylon. And so one of the things they're talking a lot about is, what does a groom owe a bride?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a financial thing. Wedding was seen as a financial thing more than a romantic thing. And what happens if he wants to divorce her? What does he owe her? And so there's a lot of finances involved in community relations.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't have it, then you have resentment, and then you have a lot worse things.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
When people say it's not about the money, it usually means it's about the money.
Right.
So, it wasn't just Jews, but even in the Torah, Joseph in the Bible is Pharaoh's main money guy. We're told he's the mashpir, he's the supplier of goods and services. In fact, in the Torah, it says that he went one day to the house to do his work. And the rabbis of ancient days say he was an accountant. Sounds like a joke, but no, he was an accountant. At this time, it wasn't the Pharaoh, it was a rich guy named Potiphar. But that was his job to do. Now, in this story, Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, so the story goes in a different direction. But for the ancient rabbis, Joseph was the first accountant.
Wow.
Can we talk about the Talmud?
Sure.
And can you maybe enlighten us from your perspective on what the Talmud is? And also kind of put this on the screen a little bit.
So the Talmud, the word Talmud means learning, but it specifically refers to the fact that about 2,000 years ago, we have something called rabbis. Never had rabbis before. We had teachers, but not rabbis. And during this period, there was a need to codify Jewish law because the laws in the Torah were all over the place. They were hard to know what to do. And so they started writing different laws based on the Torah, but sometimes reflecting more of life's complexities. So when it says in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, don't work on the Sabbath, that's pretty vague. What does that mean? So the rabbis in the Talmud come up with 39 categories of work you can't do. Everything from lighting a fire to ripping something to all sorts of things, to traveling a certain amount. And so that's the Talmud. Now, there's also stories and legends and all sorts of things. People call the Talmud an ocean or a sea. Because perhaps we could use the word encyclopedia today that didn't exist 1,000 years ago. But it's the center part of Jewish life. When a Jewish Orthodox kid is studying from about age 7 until the rest of his life, most likely he's studying the Talmud. It's about 63 volumes. So as I said, if you study one page a day, it'll still take 7.5 years to get through the whole thing.
Oh, wow. Do you know if there is I tried to look it up quickly, but do you know if there is a place where we could see what the daily page is?
Oh, yes. You just have to know how to say it in Hebrew. And you find a million places, podcasts and the like. It's called Daf Yomi. D-A-F Yomi. Daf is page, Yomi is daily. There's a particular podcast I love.
Dafyomi.org.
Well, there's a million places. There's a podcast out of Israel I love called, from a place called Hadran, Hadran, and it's led by a woman. And originally it was just 4 women, but now because of the pandemic, it really goes out to the whole world.
You mentioned 39
categories.
Of work
you can't do. Yeah.
Is there, when I ask these questions, obviously sometimes I act a little coy, like I don't know,
sure.
But it's our viewers probably don't know a lot about this stuff, so that's why I'm bringing it up.
Yeah, it's definitely.
So, what is the significance of numerology in the Talmud, and is there a significance to 39?
There's something called gematria, which is the rabbinic way of using numbers to explain a lot of things. So, for instance, 18 is a special number because in Hebrew, you write with Hebrew numbers, it's chai, which is life.
Mm-hmm.
The 39, I don't know of having any particular numerology. The way the rabbis come up with this list is sort of interesting, though. They say, look, God created the world. God rested on the 7th day. We didn't create the world, so we can't really go by that. But through God's commands, we did create a sacred space, first in the desert and then in Jerusalem. And we can look at the Torah and we can break down the things we did to create that space before we rested. And it turns out if you break it down, it's 39 things. So there are certain numbers that are big in Judaism, 10, 40. Whenever it's 40, like 40 days, 40 nights, 40 years, that's because the period of gestation for a human fetus is 40. So that's always telling you something about rebirth or something.
Interesting.
But 39, I will say one thing. Here's one of the interesting ones I was just telling our 10th graders this week. If you're Orthodox to this day, on the Sabbath, you're not allowed to break these 39 things. So you cannot tear paper.
Wow.
Unless you have a fancy French toilet, that means you got a problem if you've got to tear toilet paper on the Sabbath.
Huh.
So what did traditional Jews do?
A day, I don't know.
No, that would be the fancy French way to go.
Right.
No, they tear it before the Shabbat.
Oh, they have it torn off.
You have to guestimate how much you're going to need before the Sabbath.
Oh my gosh.
So interesting.
And you're like, but last night I just ate at Skyline Chili.
Yeah. So
And you're like,
tear
today's
some
gonna be a
more.
problem.
Tear some more. Right?
Or you can have a friend tear it for you.
Well, only a non-Jewish friend. And then you cannot
Non-Jewish
ask
friend,
them to
right.
do it. You can only suggest that they do it.
Right.
Boy, I sure could use some more toilet paper.
Right.
It is widely known that the tobacco and diet industries lobby governments with scientific propaganda for years until proven guilty in court. The artificial treatment of our water is the next corporate deception.
For example, virtually every nation in Europe has rejected the use of artificial fluoride. International studies since the 40s have repeatedly shown that endocrine and neurological effects increase after repeated consumption, even at the levels accepted by U.S. government.
Epic Water Filters is the most thorough industry-grade filtration system that Houston Ensemble has ever used. They reduce heavy metals upwards of 99.5%, such as lead and mercury, bacteria like E. coli, and poisons like chromium, nitrate, and fluoride.
Join us in our journey to living a toxin-free life and get your Epic Water Filter using discount code Houston Ensemble lowercase one word. That's Houston Ensemble lowercase one word for 20% off your Epic Water Filter.